Okay, thank you. So we're very happy to be here. Actually, I want to start with a little disclaimer because I think our paper is very tentative. This is our very initial sort of intervention into this field. So we really came here to study. I'm studying algorithms in media platforms. It's very different. Yoav is working on the history of criminology. So I don't know anything about criminology. I think Yoav doesn't know still a lot about big data and algorithms. So we're going to try to be very short because we really want to get your comments. So in this presentation, we wish to unravel the conception of humans that underlies algorithmic risk assessments, which I don't need to clarify at this point what it means, and which is increasingly used in the criminal justice system. We're making three assumptions about algorithmic risk assessment. One, we look at it as an episteme, as a new way of knowing, which has its own unique logic, not simply as technological or technical advancement. So we're trying to overcome the problem of technological determinism, as if we have new machines, and let's see what they can do and evaluate them. We're trying to relate this new way of assessing risk to the roots of criminology, as I said, rather than to new technologies. Second assumptions we're making is that we see algorithmic risk assessment as part of a much larger epistemic change happening in a myriad of fields. It has been mentioned before here: insurance, finance, medicine, media. So 2 points to take from that. One is, indeed, one of the problems with algorithmic knowledge is its claim to be universal and to be, in a way, agonistic to a particular field or to the particular field in which it's implemented, because it's presumably just mathematical. It lies outside of human values. And the second point to take from that is that we think it might be worthwhile to not just to go deeply into the criminal justice system, but also to look sideways, to, in a way, make our own predictive analysis concerning where we might be heading from learning from how algorithms are used in other domains, as I said, such as insurance or medicine. And the third point that I want to make at the beginning is that we understand algorithmic risk assessment as a substantial development that speaks to a new penology. Now, by referring to a new episteme, we mean, as I said, a new way of knowing. Algorithmic risk assessment looks at risk and evaluates risk in a new way, which signals both a continuity of established ways of risk assessment and also a break from them. And importantly, this new way of addressing risk, we argue, also presupposes a new understanding of human nature and of criminality. Our theoretical point of departure is that underlying scientific ways of knowing humans is some conceptions of what humans are, what their essence is. This view is obviously inspired by Foucault, and I must, because Mark is sitting here, I must mention that Mark has been writing beautifully about that in the context of surveillance and media. But it is also shared by criminologists who have quite different disciplinary affinities, such as Michael Gottfredson and Travis Hirschi, who state in their seminal book, A General Theory of Crime, and I quote, "A conception of crime presupposes a conception of human nature." So here we wish to unravel the conception of humans that underlies algorithmic knowledge by historicizing it. We recall the history of criminological knowledge and distinguish the algorithmic episteme from two earlier epistemes that dominated the field. And we think that this is important, especially because one of the claims of algorithmic knowledge is that it can create knowledge about individuals without needing to have any preconceptions of human nature. It doesn't need to appeal to kind of metaphysical human essence. And as a result, As a result, this claim or such discourse argues that algorithmic risk assessment is more scientific and objective method of knowing. And we'd like to call this supposition into question by uncovering the conception of humans that informs algorithmic knowledge within the criminal justice system, which we call the algorithmic self, and point to possible ramifications of this new conception of self on penology. So we move now to this history.
Thank you. So modern systems of social control and criminology that informs this were based on two previous assumptions about or conceptions about humans. We titled them the rational self and the pathological self. Historically, it was the rational self that was the guiding episteme of the classical school in criminology, which, as you know, came out of the Enlightenment, and actually wanted to construct a just system based on the episteme of the rational self. The idea was to break out from the corrupt systems of sovereign privilege and arbitrariness and to replace it with a just system in which autonomous, rational people who are now constructing a political community will come together and agree on a social contract. Now, the fathers of the classical school in criminology also thought that humans, as self-interested and pleasure-seeking creatures, are liable to break their own rules, and therefore the state should use punishment as a mean to deter them and others. Based on the rational self, the fathers of the classical school in criminology took crime to be a natural form of behavior, not some unique form of behavior. They assume that individuals understand their actions and also understand the consequences of these actions. And this is, of course, informed their penology, which asserted that it is justified to punish people for their crimes, for their offenses. The only thing is that punishment should be used as a utility for deterrence and not something for retribution. Now, by the end of the 19th century, I'm making a very long history, very, very short, of course. By the end of the 19th century, a new school of thought became dominant in the field of criminology, and this is the Positivist School, which was introduced a rather paradigmatic shift in the way crime was understood. Briefly, they assumed that delinquent behavior was an outcome of some deviant cause, either internal or external, and therefore offenders have mitigating circumstance for their culpability. Now, although less explicitly, the Positivist School also had a conception about human nature. And one of the things that underlined this conception was a separation between the normal and the pathological. With the pathological self in itself was perceived as a dual self, in which not only do human behavior is determined by either internal or external forces, but that these forces, it is doubtful whether people can control these factors or forces, and it is even doubtful whether they are aware of those forces. With this in mind, they concluded that simply reason cannot really uncover or explain human behavior, and instead what you need is a rigorous etiological research based both on theory and empirical research in order to explore and discover the causes for delinquency and criminality, with the motivation later to treat these causes. And this is, of course, what informed their form of penology, which wanted to shift the classical mode of punishment into non-penal forms of punishment and even to rehabilitation. Now, I have to note that at least at the early days of the Positivist School, there were also talks about some forms of population management which were quite draconian, but the most influenced the penal system was indeed the direction of non-penal forms and rehabilitation, which came to its heights around the 50s and the 60s of the 20th century with what David Garland called penal welfarism. Now, the influence of the pathological self declined once another paradigmatic shift occurred within the field of criminology, and here I'm referring to the managerial movement, which is arguably the most dominant development in the field of criminology since the 1970s. The managerial movement set out to harness the production of criminological knowledge as administrative criminology for optimization of policy and practice. Now, initially, both the rational self and the pathological self played a role within this movement, which is to say that what we're going to hear in a moment about the algorithmic episteme was by no means an overnight revolution. The basic premise of the managerial movement was that crime is an integral part of human nature and human society, which, in this sense, they share the principles of the classical school, and actually more so of neo-classical theories that were prevalent at the time. The founding father, or the advocates of the managerial movement, argued that because crime is a given fact, it does not need to be explained, but managed. In other words, that the role of criminology should be to address the effects of crime rather than its causes, like the Positivist School sought to do. Now, having said that, this movement still had strong links to the Positivist School and even to the pathological self. For and foremost, they used the same positivist tools in their research, but moreover, it tapped into early inclinations that the fathers of the positive schools already made at the turn of the 20th century, where they suggested or actually argued that all the criminal justice needs to do is to simply divide between non-dangerous, semi-dangerous, and dangerous people. And indeed, one of the main developments of the managerial movement was that crime came to be viewed as a routine risk that needs to be calculated and managed, and therefore here comes risk assessment. Now, as I'm sure you know, the first risk assessment were based on clinical assessment. Then came the actuarial model, first the static, then the dynamic. But what is interesting is that the actuarial statistical modeling was based on predetermined individual risk factors. Of course, these risk factors were based or the product of etiological studies about delinquent behavior. The new thing was that they were used differently. Instead of factors that were supposed to lead to some kind of treatment and rehabilitation, as they were used before under the assumption of the pathological self, now they were used as a way to manage and control risk. And this is sort of the change and the moment that, so to speak, invited the algorithmic episteme to come and advance risk assessment.
Yeah, so I think I'm just going to mention a few tenets of the algorithmic knowledge in general, which we think really fits into this tendency of criminology towards prediction, etc., things that are get their answer with algorithmic knowledge. So just for tenets, very quickly, one is that it's really geared towards prediction without really much need for theory. Because of that, and that's the second point, it has an omnivorous approach to data. If you can, and any data that can be gathered might actually tell you something about, or might help you predict. Third point is the notion of posteriori validation, what they call in the industry A/B testing. You just you work out which algorithm works best. So that's a different way of explaining. It's not really an explanation. And it is opaque rather than transparent. That this has been talked about, the fact that algorithms, or the whole system that we call here as a shorthand algorithms, is very much black box. So what is the image of the algorithmic self that emerges from that episteme? Maybe let me mention 3 key points. One is that humans, in this case offenders, are their data. There is no mediating construct of a theory of the self, merely data patterns. And Yoav will in a minute say what we think the ramifications of that are. Second point is that this calls for a surface analysis without any allusion for a deep structure. And the third point is that each offender is seen as sui generis, without reference to general theoretically informed categories such as sociological categories or psychological pathologies. We kind of reverse engineering. You in ProPublica, I think you're actually kind of reverse engineer and say, hey, there is something going on with race. But when they actually do the engineering, race is not necessarily a factor. In sum, according to the algorithmic episteme, to know people does not mean to analytically and empirically understand the causes of their behavior, but rather to be able to recognize their data patterns. And this obviously excludes any attempt for a sociological, psychological, or indeed any theoretical etiology, and signals a rejection of any essentialism in the perception of humans.
So what I want to do now is just to have a short concluding remarks, and this is where we sort of make the jump, and perhaps you will stop us. Jonathan Simon and Malcolm Philly wrote in the Referat article from '92 that the actuarial model leads to a new penology. What we think is that actually only now with the algorithmic risk assessment, this type of penology comes to its fruition. Whereas the rational self and the pathological self, each in their own way, preserved a gap between a structural ontological depth, that is the utopian, the desire, the ideal, and the surface phenomena, the actual way people perform. The algorithmic episteme, as you just heard, does not consider it. In other words, the rational self and the pathological self preserve the critical distance between the self as an ideal and the acting self. It means that they preserved or maintain a path towards a course of redemption. And of course, criminal justice system build their penology based on this path or based on this gap. But now with the algorithmic episteme, this gap and path no longer exist. And what we are thinking that it leads to a type of a non-penology penology. It is a non-penology penology because this gap, because people are their data patterns, and there is no room for redemption. And therefore, we are sort of playing with the words and calling it a non-penology. Thank you.
Thank you very much.